First of all, welcome to the last week or so of our class. I don't know about you guys, but I've really learned a lot. I have managed to really kind of transform my thinking about research in terms of it not being just data collection, right? It's really adding to the world's knowledge. And it's a beautiful thing, especially approached in a biblical fashion. So, my topic, I'll go ahead and advance the slide for you guys, is actually going to be the multivariate effects of segregation, desegregation, resegregation, potentially, given the current governmental administration. And I'm going to explore teacher diversity during this segregation to desegregation process, and potentially look at ramifications for not having teacher diversity anymore. So we're looking at student learning outcomes, experiences, and overall educational attainment levels in terms of qualitative and quantitative research. But we'll explore that more in a bit. So when I was doing my research in terms of literature review, I came across something that was so kind of inflammatory that at first I really just was taken aback. And I'll read it to you. Reardon et al. 2022 stated prior research shows that the desegregation of Southern schools beginning in the 1960s led to significant benefits for Black students. Less clear, however, is whether segregation today has the same harmful effects as it did 50 years ago. We'll find out later in the piece, especially if you're able to read my paper, that actually during segregated times when students actually had black black teachers primarily, they actually really thrived. The main issue was resources in terms of books and things like that, but the actual teaching and the actual care and the actual things that were indicated and shared by black teachers really helped black students. And we'll also see that today black student or black teachers, when they're in the school systems, actually help instruct people of all creeds and colors. Okay, I wanted to show this picture because it really, to me, symbolizes the separation and the outward looking in, and sort of the overall feel of segregation and potentially going back to um, that in modern times. All right, I've kind of already done the introduction, but basically, we're going to look at our methodology. We're going to look at some of the literature. We are going to look at our data that we want to collect. We're going to look at objectives, of course, our project goals overall, and then we're going to look at some of the specific literature that I've collected thus far. A little bit about me. We didn't do our intros like we do in our courses, but I was born in Tucson, Arizona, and crazily enough, right after the civil rights movement, right? We think of it as being so far away, but it's really within about a generation and a half. So I'm an entrepreneur. I started my first business in my 20s. I am a self-published author. I have about 13 publications on Amazon. I'm a poet. I love to collect information, which you might expect. I love research classes. My undergrad was in math and business studies. I have a Master of Management and Organizational Leadership and a Master of Education in Instructional Technology. I love traveling, cooking, and eating. I mentioned this mainly because you'll get an idea of kind of my background. Um, I was thinking about whether or not I thought it was a good idea for us to be on camera, right? Because that always can lead to bias when you're interacting with people. But I think it's important to, as we learned in this course, understand our own biases so that is not going to affect our research or our research aims. And that's something I've learned. It's something I'm also working on as well because we are humans after all, right? Okay, let's look at our objectives. Our first objective is to look at the artifacts that are available, whether it's first-hand recordings um, of people who grew up during segregation. I have a cousin who experienced segregation, desegregation believe he was born in the 30s. My grandmother actually supplied information for a book, and so I'm going to include that information from my grandmother. I also have a cousin who was one of the first students who integrated, probably the first student who integrated Ole Miss. His name was James Meredith, and I have a signed copy of his book. So those kind of artifacts are going to be integrated into my research, as well as other information I will glean from newspapers and all sorts of other sources. The second objective is to actually collect my own data through interviews, focus groups. There'll be three tiers of this data collection, and then look at as much as possible to gain information for these for the segregation and desegregation periods. All right, our project goals. As I mentioned before, I really want to collect historical data and artifacts. We're seeing a significant kind of erasure of historical information. So that's why I think it's super, super important to record it and have it somewhere for posterity. The other thing I want to do is use surveys to obtain primary data. That's going to be in a series of different surveys, depending on whether it's for a teacher, students, administrators, or the general populace. We're going to have our third goal, which is basically to, after we've collected these two segments or sources of information, we want to collect and analyze it. And then we want to look at the next level of actually having one on one interviews, having focus groups, so we can glean some more qualitative information as we go on in our research aims. All right. I talked a little bit about the methodology, and we're going to use a mixed method because we're going to be using quantitative and qualitative information. And I thought it was important to do that because, of course, we can collect data on how well the learning outcomes were achieved, what were the educational attainment levels, and that's very important to serve as a starting point. But then we also want to receive information specifically from people about their journeys, and that's going to provide a more rich picture of what has happened during these periods. So, in essence, as I mentioned before, we're going to use survey instruments, documents, visual material, census data, ex post facto research, and we're also going to use a lot of diversity statistics, which are available particularly in Title I schools. We are also going to have these interviews and focus groups become more of a narrative, and that's going to form a framework that will hopefully touch legislators, touch people who control the funding if we do have to go into a resegregation period. So the separate but equal will actually be equal this time around if it comes about. So some of the literature that I've looked at thus far, we as researchers, we don't try to skew our research, right? So we're trying to really just glean sources from both sides of the equation. I have been finding a lot of information about um, really there being segregation regardless, because it was really placed along um, geographic regions, and a lot of what we found is geographic regions separate according to poverty levels or affluence levels. And so, even though it wasn't necessarily segregated by race, it became economic segregation. And so, that's something, if we are really interested in um, resegregating, that'll be an interesting thing because it already is really segregated. So, those kinds of things we're really exploring with the literature to see what is already happening and now, and what we can potentially expect in the future. Let's see. As I mentioned before, I will be doing some survey instruments, but I want to pop back to it actually went along faster than I wanted to. So we have our second source I want to talk about a bit is they actually have looked at recent cohorts to look at school readiness. And one of the things that was interesting is that as you would suggest, as you would believe, when students are entering school, there's already a difference between the different students based on whether their parents have had the time to homeschool them a bit, whether they've had time to do some preparatory work, whether they've had time to even do some pre-K schooling, and all that all really breaks down to, do they have the money to do that? So they're finding there are already significant gaps before students even enter the educational system. Another source, 15 years of data from this amazing school funding fairness data system. So that's another thing that I've really been finding that is so helpful. There's a lot of great data out there already, so I don't have to reinvent the wheel, but I want to, of course, take that to the next level and fill some gaps in. But race was found to be a factor in funding levels, as we would guess, but we don't want to guess. We want to have supportive research so we are not introducing our own biases into the research. Okay, let's talk a little bit about data collection. Sorry about that. I'm cooking at the same time. So, as far as our timeline, we're going to have a couple of different we're going to have a couple of different sequences in our phases. Collect the secondary data through our oral, written, and photographic artifacts. Phase two is going to be our surveys that we have written to um, find out from students, teachers, and administrators what their experiences have been, what they have gone on to do, and things like that. If we can't access um, our secondary data on that, we will have to obtain our own. Really depends on how much more we uncover. Phase three is, once we've done these two phases, we want to carry us focus groups and one-on-one interviews, as I said, to give a more clear and more interesting and more colorful illustration of what's going on during this process. Mentioned before, we're going to use qualitative research to inform our narratives, and the quantitative data will be able to be shared through tables and charts that will hopefully inform future funding, future studies, and things of that nature. Okay, some concluding thoughts. This is definitely a charged topic, and it's one that really started in teacher diversity. As a first-time teacher, I was so excited about diversity of teaching, and my first post as an official teacher, I actually taught high school math, and I really thoroughly enjoyed the learning process, the learning curve. It was frustrating at times. It was insane at times. It was super fun at times. But I loved that my students were able to learn from a person from a different culture. Most of my students were primarily Hispanic, Mexican American, some people from other places as well. We did have a smattering of other people from other demographics. So I really started just getting super, super interested about reviving and revisiting a teacher diversity paper I had written when I knew we were going to do this research class. And more and more, I am like so excited about uncovering ways to explore this and really show how we can all learn from each other. The other section of this is I want to say is that when I first heard about potential resegregation, believe me, my thoughts were not unbiased at all, and they still are not. However, when I saw the information from Reardon, which basically said um, the separate but equal doctrine of yesteryear is potentially not a big deal anymore. And I thought about that, and I was like, that's interesting. And the quote that came to mind is from the King James Bible, Genesis 50:20, and I'll read that so we can be on the same page about it. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is to this day, to save much people alive. Really, it's a reminder, regardless of the policies that are happening nowadays, God is in control. We are meant to use our research to record, to encourage, to illuminate, and to hopefully share some potential solutions going forward So I'm super excited to have been involved in this class. I really, really am very vested in bringing this research into fruition. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask in the discussion section. I thank you so much for your time, your attention. God bless you, and may all of your works be fruitful. Amen.